Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. C'est un grand honneur d'être ici et de parler. Je vais parler en anglais parce que mon français est un peu monsieur de bricolage. Ça marche pour 5 minutes et après, ça devient pire et pire. Alors, c'est de respect à vous que je parle en anglais. Wait. It's okay. I don't have any interests to report. In spiritual care, there's not a lot of money to make. No pharmaceutical companies are interested in it. And that's a good thing, because it makes us free people who can think freely. Now, I know we live in a culture of high pressure. Many of us do not have much time. And because you will hear a lot today at this conference, I have one slide for those of you with little patience. And also the people who say, well, what was the answer to his question? Who needs it? Integration of spirituality. Well, of course, everybody needs it, because it's in the definition of what palliative care is about. It is part of what we think we should deliver to patients and their family. And even if you look at, it's again. Even if you look at what is done in terms of research, you will find that spiritual care is a big issue. It stucks. I don't know what's happening, but my PowerPoint doesn't. Any technical assistance? I don't know, it just stops. No? It doesn't work either. I will just continue.
Il faut juste appuyer à gauche, appuyer sur le pad une fois, sur l'ordi. Vous enlevez la barre qui est en bas. Mon collègue descend. Ouais, ça, vous l'enlevez. Voilà, là, ça passe.
Ça va? Yes. Ah, bon. So if you look at what has been done in research, you will see that from 2000 onwards, a lot of research has been done in spiritual care, in medicine in general, in nursing, and also in spiritual care, in palliative care. This is interesting, because traditionally, we did not think about these issues in healthcare, and now suddenly it seems to be very important. Why is that the case? I think one of the reasons is that traditional structure of meaning are falling apart, and we are looking for new ways to give meaning to our lives. Let me address in this talk 3 questions, because we can ask, who needs integration of spiritual care? But then the first question would be, who needs what exactly? What is spiritual care? Well, spiritual care, first of all, is something very culturally determined. It is a very contextual thing. It might look differently in my country than in your country, because the very words we use might be different. And even in my country, for instance, there are a lot of people who don't like the word spiritual. I worked on a guideline in spiritual care and palliative care with a group of people, and we did not agree about the title of the guideline. So this is a very sensitive area where words may open doors or close doors. And the second thing is that for many people, when they think about spiritual, they think about religious. And they say, well, I'm not religious. It's not for me. I know that in France, you have a very special history when we talk about relation between religion and society. In my country, it's more or less the same. It's only 13 or 14% of Dutch people who say that they are religious people and believe in God. The majority of people say they are not religious. So there is a big challenge here. Let us begin by understanding the question by listening to a young physician. This is a physician working in a hospice in the Netherlands. A young guy, I think he is 38 years old. And he writes on the internet about his experiences as a doctor. And one of the texts he has written is about an old lady he is helping to cope with her life, with her end of life. And this lady says, "I took every chance and fought for what I'm worth." And then the reflection of the physician starts. Also this time, she will take every chance for treatment if there is one. But at the same time, there is a voice in her that says that it has been enough. And there are more voices to be heard inside her. The fear of what is about to come, having to let go of her daughters with whom she has become a trinity after her divorce. The different ways of processing things which characterizes each of them, the frictions this can bring about, her role as a mother who wants to care and continue caring, the big support she has received from the case manager of Bado Hospice, the necessity to think about the preferred place of dying that you do not want, but that you have to. It is a cacophony of voices, a choir in which every time another voice is singing the lead. Confusing, but certainly not unusual for people in her situation. I tell her, if we succeed in seeing the plurality of voices as a choir, it might result in the possibility to give every voice attention when it sings the lead. In our conversation together, we listen to the different voices. This is just a short example of a doctor talking to a patient, and I would say that this is an excellent example of what spiritual care might be. It starts by listening very carefully to the patient. And many patients do not have a clear idea about which way they are going, because there are many voices in them. And in some research we did in the Netherlands, we studied the dynamics of hope in palliative patients, and we found that many times people have different hopes at the same time. They hope they will have time to say goodbye to their children. They hope, maybe secretly, that they will even recover, although they know that they will not recover. So it is a choir in their head, and it takes time and attention to help listening and help giving these voices a little more idea about what it means. What are the most important leads in these many voices? Now, this also means that if we are thinking about spirituality, we might want a definition. Because if I'm just saying to you, well, it's like a choir, you might say, well, how do I know whether the choir sings a spiritual or a psychological or a social or another theme? And for that reason, in the European Association, we try to have consensus about the definition, what we think spiritual care would be. And this is a working definition. It means that it is an attempt to grasp something which can hardly be put into words. In this definition, we say spirituality is the dynamic dimension of human life that relates to the way persons, individual and community, experience, express, and or seek meaning, purpose, and transcendence, and the way they connect to the moment, to self, to others, to nature, to the significant and or the sacred. I remember when we made this definition, we were very happy that we were able to put something into words that was hardly graspable. At the same time, immediately there rose a problem, because one of the people present in the room was a Roman Catholic priest who was very unhappy with the definition. He said, "This is not a good definition because the center of my life is not here in the definition." And we asked him, "What is the center of your life?" And he said, "God." And then there was a humanist from the Netherlands who said, "Well, if God is in the definition, then I am out." And this is exactly what makes spiritual care sometimes so difficult, because what is the most important in some people's lives doesn't play a role in other people's lives. Now, there was a very intelligent German theologian in the room, and he said, "Well, the good thing about God is that you cannot see him. So if you believe in God, you will discover God everywhere in creation. Maybe you should look again at the definition with the eyes of believing and see if you can discover God." And then the priest said, "I can agree, because he is there." Now, this is just an example of how sensitive this area is, and also how hard to define. Because if you would have a little more time, I could explain to you that this is a multi-dimensional field in which there are existential challenges, there are value-based consideration and attitudes, many ethical subjects have a spiritual dimension, and for some people there are religious considerations and foundations, because for some people their spiritual life is entirely religious. Now, when I give lectures in my country, I always say to people, forget everything about my talk, but just remember two words, the word meaning and the word connection, because that is what it's all about. What is meaningful to people? And if you want to know what is meaningful, they will start telling you the things or the persons they are connected with, because connectedness is the essence of meaning. Now, there is a difficulty when we're talking about the question what people exactly need, because we cannot ask about what people spiritually need in the same way as we ask other questions. I will come to that in a minute. And that is why we said, well, maybe we should start thinking about spirituality not as an isolated area, not something you can make a distinction between the spiritual and the social or the psychological. No, it is a dimension. If you see how spirituality plays a role in people's lives, it is through these social issues. For many people, the connectedness with their children, for instance, is very important. Is this a social thing or a spiritual thing? It is both. It is obviously a social thing, because we are social human beings. But the impact and the connection with the existential dimension of their life is so big, so great, that it is at the same time a spiritual thing. And we know this very well when people lose a child, for instance. It is not something of psychological coping alone. No, it is a very existential experience which questions the very foundations of your own life. So let us never look at these things as isolated areas, but let us look at it as dimension of a reality that cannot be cut into pieces. Now, if we have an idea about what spirituality might be, what does need then mean here? Well, that is also not an easy question to answer, because if we talk about healthcare, many times we think it is very easy to ask what people need. If you go to a doctor, the doctor might ask, what's the problem? And you say, well, my knee hurts. Okay, the doctor says, let me look, and maybe we can solve it. In spiritual care, you cannot go on like this for many people, because many people do not have clear, they have these many voices, this choir inside their head. In America, they tried to go straight forward, and they went to in the hospital, they went to a bed, and they asked the patients, how is your relationship with God? Good, bad, don't know. It doesn't work. Many people have a very complex relationship with these issues, and they cannot put it into 2 or 3 words. So instead of trying to ask for a need, a problem, or a desire, sometimes it is better to try to resonate with the unspeakable. That means that you open up as a caregiver, like the doctor in the example did, and try to listen very carefully to the many voices that are there. And you might find sometimes that patients at the beginning do not want to talk to you. A friend of mine is chaplain in one of the hospitals in the Netherlands. And she said, 2 years ago, she said, the hospital, for privacy reasons, said that I could only visit patients if patient filled in a little form in which they said, I want to see the chaplain or the spiritual caregiver. Now she said, I noticed after a couple of weeks that my job started to disappear because there were no forms delivered. There were almost no patients who filled in the form, I want to see a chaplain. So she said, I went to the patients. I knocked on the door and I said, hello, I am the chaplain. I'm here to give you spiritual care. Is it true that you do not want to see me? And the first patients he visited said, yes, that is very true. Enter the room, sit down, and I will explain you exactly why I do not want to see you. 1.5 hours later, she was standing. She wanted to leave because she had other things to do. And the patient said, you'll be coming back next week, won't you? Now, what is the case? For many patients, they need a kind of extra cue or extra thing to talk about these issues. And they need someone they can trust. And maybe they will talk to the physician and not to the spiritual caregiver, because they have the feeling, the intuition that the physician will understand them. And maybe the chaplain doesn't understand them, or vice versa. And this is a very interesting thing that we also see in research that has been done. There has been a great project, a worldwide research, in which patients and caregivers were put into focus groups and were interviewed in these focus groups. And it was worldwide. There were people from Canada, UK, Finland, Belgium, all kinds of people from all around the world. And what we found in this research was that the spiritual care providers, patients and their relatives wanted, were a wide range, including specialists, but also non-specialists, sometimes volunteers, sometimes family members. Nurses and healthcare assistants have most contact and familiarity, but physicians are central to illness and treatment, and that is why many patients also want to hear their physicians about these things. Today in the Netherlands, there will be a research presented to the media among cancer patients. It was a research in which cancer patients were asked, what do you expect from your caregivers? And more than 60% of these cancer patients said, well, it's very important that with my caregiver I can talk about the existential or spiritual issues. And maybe this is not the right person to give accompaniment, but they should know that this dimension is important to me, because I am not just an organ or a patient, I'm also a human being. And in order to treat me well, you should know me well. According to patients and their family, spiritual care is a responsibility of all staff. You cannot assign it to the chaplain alone, or as they in the United States say, this would be a kind of chaplain dumping. And that is not the way spiritual care should look like. Now, of course, the next question would be, what does spiritual care, good spiritual care, look like? According to patients and the families, essential is human connection. If there is no human connection, forget about it. You can have beautiful checklists and tools, but it will not work, because human connection is the first and most important thing. Patients express this at putting the patient first, going the extra mile, integrated into care. And how do we recognize a good spiritual care provider? Well, they are genuine people. They are authentic. They are non-judgmental. They don't try to convert you to Christianity or Buddhism or Islam. No, they are open and honest. In the Netherlands, when we presented these things, many people asked, well, you cannot expect all this from a physician, do you? I mean, a general practitioner in my country has 10 minutes to see a patient. So how to do spiritual care in 10 minutes? It's impossible, isn't it? Well, maybe we should make a distinction between different levels of spiritual care. This month, we will present an evidence-based guideline in spiritual care that we worked on for many years, and it has been approved by many professional organizations in the Netherlands. And in this guideline, we distinguish between 3 levels of spiritual care. The first level is the general level of attention, paying attention to what is important for the patient. If you do this, you do not need extra time. It is the way in which you listen that matters. And if you resonate with the unspeakable when you are talking to a patient, or if you are a nurse, when you are taking care of a patient or washing a patient, you will see that a different conversation starts. And sometimes patients will ask you to accompany them, or you will get a feeling that they need someone to talk to. And then you can try to see who is in your team or who is in the neighborhood that you can refer to. So attention sometimes leads to accompaniment, and what you try to avoid is that people end up in an existential or spiritual crisis, because this adds suffering, and that is what you do not want in palliative care. Now, if you look at spiritual care in this way, you will understand that it asks for different formation on different levels to different disciplines. And that is what we are working now on, both in my country and in the European Association for Palliative Care. Let us go back to this attention dimension. How do you pay attention? What words do you use? For this, I think there is a wonderful tool developed in the UK with only 3 very basic questions that are very deep, I think. The first is a very open question. How do you make sense of what is happening to you? You can find your own words for this. Maybe this is not the right way to ask it in France, I don't know. But how do you cope with your situation? And when people start to talk about it, they will talk not only about what they find difficult, but indirectly also about what is meaningful to them and with what or whom they are connected. Then the next question could be, what sources of strength do you look to when life is difficult? Again, this is about connectedness. What is your inspiration? What is that source that gives you power to deal with your situation? And maybe you have experiences in your life you can fall back on. And then the third question, would you find it helpful to talk to someone who could help you explore the issues of spirituality? Now, sometimes people say, no, I do not want to talk to anyone, but it was good that you opened it. And sometimes people need a little more time. And maybe now they say no, but when you open it a next time, they will say, yes, now the time is there to speak about it. Because I've never thought about it in my whole life, and now suddenly I have to do a kind of very quick development to catch up with my situation. A second tool that is very helpful is a tool that can help you to arrive at a spiritual level of what people are saying. It is a kind of listening exercise. I have a very simple example. A woman in her mid-40s has 4 children at home, and she's suffering from breast cancer, and it is clear that she will not survive. And she is in the hospital, and she says, I cannot sit around the table with my children next Sunday. What is the meaning of what she's saying? Well, there may be different levels of meaning. Of course, there is a physical description of reality. I am here and I cannot be there. But there is also a level of emotions. There is longing, there is sadness, there is sorrow. And implicitly, she tells something very important about her life story, about her identity as a mother who has connectedness, there we have the word again, connectedness with her children, which is so existential that this is maybe the most important for her in her current situation. And with telling about these existential connections, she tells something about the sources, the inspiration she lives from. So there is this description of reality, but underneath there is this spiritual dimension that is also communicated. And the art of hearing is the art of picking up these dimensions. Now, there are many tools available if you look on the internet. One of the things I developed myself is a tool that focuses on 5 important questions that have been important for 100 years. It is based on a very old medieval model. The question, who am I? And what do I really want? How do I deal with suffering? How can I say goodbye? How do I look back on my life? And what can I hope for? 5 seemingly simple questions, but also very deep questions. Questions that bring you to this existential dimension. And it takes time and it takes attentiveness to listen to these questions and to open them up. The last part of my presentations is about the question, who needs integration of spiritual care? Now, you might think that I already answered this question because I talked about patients and their families. But let us listen to another young doctor from my country who is a lung specialist. His name is Sander de Hosson, and he writes in blogs on the internet, he writes about his own experiences as a physician. And in this short fragment, he tells us about his first experiences of telling a very young patient that this patient is not going to live for a long time. When I ask the nurse to call the family and schedule a meeting for later today, I start to feel cold. A strange feeling in my stomach. How, for heaven's sake, to tell someone who's barely 20 years old that he is going to die? Although sometimes I have conversations like this several times in 1 week, it is impossible that they become a routine. I have learned from earlier conversations. One of the biggest mistakes I have made was to keep on talking, for yes, that is what I have done, endlessly, about treatments, about chemotherapy, about radiations, about choices between all this, and about everything that is not yet important for a patient on that moment. The best one can do is bringing the message quickly and clearly. As a rule, only 3 sentences are needed, because it is that one sentence, or as a matter of fact, that one word about which everything revolves. You will die. Everything said in addition during those first moments in which the death sentence is declared is useless and meaningless. Because perhaps it seems completely silent in the room, the heads in front of me fill themselves with a deafening noise, the noise of total panic. How arrogant to think that this can be changed with a few words from my side, words that are not suitable in such moments. Madness cannot be grasped in words. I prepare myself. I start. I will always continue to remember well how insecure I will sound. With a stuttering voice, I tell about the scan in a sentence that ends in the diagnosis, lung cancer. Then I tell him that the disease cannot be cured. I tell him that finally he will die. And then I stop talking. There is complete silence, perhaps for minutes. At least, this is how it feels. Minutes in which no one says anything, in which he will zoom out and will look away over the fields and trees, in which his mother will wrap an arm around him. I don't think I will ever see an image of greater horror in my career than this one image. Who needs integration of spiritual care? I would argue that all people working, being together in palliative care need this, because all of us have to deal with our, what I call inner space, with this inner life in which we have to deal with these many voices in our heads, with this maybe total panic sometimes. And all of us need these moments in which we will go back inside and reflect upon what we have experienced, what we have felt, and how we can continue doing the work that we do, because it is demanding. Now, if we are talking about caregivers and the need for spiritual care of caregivers, as a European association, we also did in our task force another survey in which we asked caregivers, what do you think the most important things are that we should do research on? There was a big survey in 2012, and almost 1,000 people from all over the world responded, people working in palliative care, people like you, professionals, researchers, people who were dedicating their lives to giving good palliative care. And they said, well, if we can choose the 5 most important issues, the things we need in our practice, the top 5 looks like this. We need screening tools to identify patients with spiritual needs. We need conversation models for conversations with patients, and we need an evaluation of the effectiveness of spiritual care. Now, as I told you, screening tools might be important, but don't forget that they're just tools. And a tool, if you look at the hammer, for instance, it can be very effective by putting a nail in the wall. but you can also harm yourself if you don't use it well. So a tool alone doesn't help you. You need a practice, a culture, you need some more to use the tool well. And this is precisely why spiritual care is something that is also important for yourself in order to use the tool in the right way. I'm going to end my presentation, and the last thing I want to show you is another important paper that we wrote about what might be the core competencies in palliative care when it comes to spiritual care. Now, in 2013, Phil Larkin and two other colleagues published a paper in which they try to give a kind of guideline for general palliative care and the palliative care approach about 10 core competencies for people. And if we look at the core competencies for spiritual needs, you will see that in the first place, you see the competency of the professionals to demonstrate the reflective capacity to consider the importance of spiritual and existential dimensions in their own lives. That's where it starts. And once you've done that, then you can listen better to what goes on in the heads and hearts of other people. And then, of course, integrate the patients' and families' spiritual, existential, and religious needs in the care plan, respecting their choice not to focus on this aspect if they wish so, because not everyone wants to talk about it. Many people are very, it is a very private thing for many people. It doesn't mean that you do not have to try to open it up, but it means that you have to respect when they do not want to talk about it. Then, of course, provide opportunities for patients and families to express this dimension in their lives in a supportive and respectful manner. And lastly, be conscious about the boundaries that may need to be respected in terms of cultural taboos, values, and choices. Currently, we are working on a white paper with people from many countries, also of France, and Nicolas Pujol is involved in this, trying to work this out more concretely. What can we offer people working in practice in terms of concrete trainings and activities to meet these demands, you could always say, to give good spiritual care. Well, this is what I would like to say for a start. And it's just the beginning. Because if you're talking about this issue, my experience is that the longer you are working on it, the longer you will find, on the one hand, how complex it is, but on the other hand, how easy it can be when you find your own way of dealing with it. It is a kind of personal journey into your own style of giving spiritual care. Thank you very much for your attention.
Merci beaucoup, Carlo, pour cette présentation très riche qui, je pense, va susciter de nombreuses questions. Donc, n'hésitez pas à vous manifester. Il y a des micros. Et pour les plus timides, vous pouvez également écrire votre question. Je vous poserai peut-être la première. Vous avez beaucoup parlé de comportement, de savoir-être face à cette question. Et quelle peut être l'importance de la formation, que ce soit celle des soignants ou des bénévoles, à cette dimension spirituelle? Est-ce que vous pensez qu'il faut être formé à cette dimension?
Yes, I think it is very important to pay attention to this dimension in formation. In my experience, the question is always, should you start right at the beginning, or should you wait a little till people have some more experience? I think you have to do both. I think if you look at the training of physicians and nurses in many countries, they are trained in a very, I would also say, reductionist way of looking at reality. And there is a good thing about it, because they have to be able to define a problem and to reduce everything that comes with it. But once you have this skill of making a diagnosis or treating, then you have to look at the bigger picture again. And I think it would be good in training when we start training people to use their minds in two ways. In the reductional way, which is the way of medical science, but also the other way of humanities. And once we do that, we might become more integrated in our heads. But this is not easy, and in many countries we are only beginning to do this. And one of the very practical things you will run into is that we are having conversations at this time in my country about integrating palliative care in medicine and in nursing. And one of the first things you will discover is that people say, well, there's already too much. We have to know something about genetics, about neurology, about all these things, so there is no place for palliative care. So you need an approach, I think, which is bottom-up and top-down. You have to talk with the big bosses at the universities, and there has to be some power play, but there is also have to become a movement of people who are so engaged that they are helping to change their profession from the inside.
Merci beaucoup. Est-ce qu'il y a une question? Oui, Madame.
At the beginning of your presentation, Carlo, you talked about the difficulties you had in defining spirituality as experts.
Where are you?
I'm here.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Hi, okay.
Yeah.
So, as scientists, we like to begin all our enterprises by defining the phenomenon we're going to study, don't we?
Yeah.
How do you feel about the idea of letting the patient guide you with their own definition of spirituality? That's to say, not projecting onto them your definition of it, but letting them provide you with their definition of it just by listening to them.
That's a very good point, and that is exactly why I showed these 3 questions of the Mount Vernon Cancer Network, because they are not using the word spiritual. Because when I ask a patient, what is your spirituality? They will look at me as, are you coming from Mars? So you have to start in their language, and you have to listen. And this is also a very cultural phenomenon. We are currently doing research in people in my country, immigrants with a background from Morocco and Turkey and Suriname. And what you see in these cultures is that people, on the one hand, spirituality is all around. It is more integrated in their culture. On the other hand, you do not talk about it directly. So you need a kind of detour. One of the people compared it with an anchor. You throw an anchor, and then you try to come on board. And I think this needs a lot of sensitivity, and then you will find also the right language to talk about it. So thank you for this question.
Merci beaucoup. Une autre question? Oui, Madame.
Oui, bonjour. Merci pour cette intervention de qualité. Ben, dans la même idée, comment vous nous proposez de réagir au questionnement des patients sans être prosélyte? Est-ce que du coup vous reformulez? Est-ce que vous posez une question à leur question? Est-ce que vous répondez par le silence? Comment faites-vous pour ne pas basculer et pour justement les accompagner, en tout cas les écouter, sans en faire trop?
Let me first see if I understand the question right. How do I respond in such a way that I do not proselytize, that I'm not doing too much? Just by trying. Trial and error. So I think here these authenticity is very important. To be yourself, to be honest. And also I mean, sometimes patients tell you things that you think, this is not my religion, or I couldn't. For instance, in my country, some people believe in a very severe Christian God that punishes them. And my first reaction would be, oh, I don't think God is like that. And, you know, if I would be a bad spiritual caregiver, I would say, well, you have a Bible. I will show you some passages where God is differently than you think, and I will prove that you're not right. This isn't helpful. So I think the thing is that you are opening up, listening to what they're saying, and trying to find, how can I support you where you are? And maybe this is with a belief system that is not mine, but there must be some human connection in this belief system that may help you, and I may help you finding that, or I may try to support you. And sometimes this ends up in just being there and expressing your inability to really solve something, but not running away from it. And that might be enough. Just give the patient the feeling that they are in their struggle, not left alone. Because ultimately it is their struggle. And ultimately it is they who need to find an answer in their lives. And it would be a bit, how you call it? Maybe arrogant to think that I can cure you spiritually. You know, it's like empowering the sources of the patient. Does that help?
Merci, merci beaucoup. Une autre question? Oui, sur le côté droit, 2 questions.
Merci Carlo pour cette présentation. Donc le spiritual care, le soin spirituel, c'est 2 choses dans ta présentation. C'est une manière d'être avec les patients et les familles, de les écouter, d'être attentionné. Donc ça nous concernerait tous en tant que professionnels du soin et aussi les bénévoles. Quelle est la différence entre le spiritual care et une éthique du care? C'est-à-dire une éthique de l'attention à l'autre, à ses besoins, tel que c'est déjà défini dans tout ce mouvement de l'éthique du care. Qu'est-ce que le spiritual care apporte en plus de l'éthique du care, c'est-à-dire d'un accompagnement éthique? Et la deuxième question, c'est qu'en France, on a des psychologues cliniciens en soins palliatifs, et que le spiritual care, notamment en Amérique du Nord, c'est quelque chose qui devient une spécialité, avec des spiritual care providers. Quelle différence entre le travail d'un psychologue en soins palliatifs, qui est attentif aux dimensions existentielles, et un spiritual care provider? Qu'est-ce que ça apporte de plus ou d'autre? Merci.
Well, Nicholas, these are very complex questions. The first question about the difference between spiritual care and an ethics of care, I would say that they overlap. So I would say that good spiritual care has also an ethical dimension. And I will give you an example. I was at a conference in the UK this year about forgiveness. And there was some psychologists from America talked about forgiveness, and they were really big shots. And they said, well, forgiveness is something in my skin. If I can forgive, I will be more healthy and I will be doing well. So forgiveness is like, you know, it's like a therapy. I can learn to be forgiving, and that will increase my health and my life expectancy, and etc. Well, there may be some truth in this, but I think it's obvious that there is also a social dimension to forgiveness and a moral, ethical dimension to forgiveness, which is you cannot separate from the psychological one. Otherwise, you will end up in a kind of individual bubble, and you're just bouncing into other bubbles. But that is not society. That is not reality. Everything we do and think is connected to other people. So there is also, simultaneously, always this ethical dimension in what we do. And I think sometimes spiritual care, as it is developed, is too much focused on the individual and too little of this ethical dimension. And vice versa, I see a lot of ethics, clinical ethics, bioethics, that is about choices, about rational decision making. And it forgets the existential dimension and the messiness and complicatedness of people's lives. So I would say both need another. Both. And that would also be my answer to your second question. I think if we look at spiritual care as a dimension rather than a field, we will find that sometimes the psychologist is the better person with his or her background to listen to this patient, and sometimes the chaplain is the best person. In the Netherlands, we have this idea of primary and secondary framework of reference. If I'm trained as a chaplain, my primary framework of reference is chaplaincy. But I do need to know something about psychology, because the processes patients are going through have a psychological dimension, and sometimes a patient, for instance, who has a depression, he doesn't need a good chaplain, he needs someone to give him medication to give his medical condition of depression. And sometimes, if you look at psychologists, their primary reference might be psychological therapy, but if they really want to listen to what's going on in the patient, they might need to know something about the existential or religious dimension also, the secondary framework. So I think we need each other, and we will, that is one of the reasons why palliative care is seen as an interdisciplinary form of care that cannot be done by one discipline alone.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Vous avez évoqué l'évaluation de l'efficacité des soins spirituels. Est-ce que vous pensez que les méthodes quantitatives et qualitatives en termes de recherche ont leur place, ou que seules les méthodes qualitatives peuvent travailler ces questions de soins spirituels, étant donné l'intime qui est inférent à ces questions?
I think that if we're talking about how effective spiritual care might be, if we think about how effective it might be, we both need qualitative and quantitative research. I think if we really want to, there are some studies who are quantitative, who show that there might be some effectiveness, but there are two problems with it. The first is that often they are so-called black box study, so we know that there is some effect, but we do not know why and how it comes about. So therefore, and the second problem is that many of the effects of spiritual care are not like giving a medication and half an hour later the pain is gone. It might sometimes, I have a conversation and after a couple of weeks or months there may be an effect, because things have to settle down and have to be integrated, and so it's sometimes very hard to get a grip on these processes. So we also need the qualitative side, the interviews, and that might give us an idea of what is going on and how it works. But of course these are harder to put into effectivity measures. So my idea, and that is why I started with the definition slide, I think sometimes we are trying to prove something which doesn't need any proof, because we already know that it's important. So why not accept it as a dimension that has to do with our humanity? And Of course, financial people might say that I'm talking nonsense, but that is precisely the reason why I think that financial people should be subordinated to other people and not a boss.
Merci.
Oui.
Alors, oui, alors simplement, si vous pouvez vous présenter avant de poser votre question, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, bonjour, je m'appelle Alain Duc. Et en fait, ma question, c'est de savoir s'il y a des études qui ont été faites sur l'utilisation de la musique en soins spirituels. Parce que j'ai des expériences de patients qui témoignent entrer dans un espace intérieur où ils se sentent profondément bien, ou un espace sans limite. C'est-à-dire quelque chose qui amène plus à une expérience qu'à parler. C'est-à-dire quelque chose de non-verbal.
Et juste, vous êtes soignant, monsieur?
Je suis
Vous
musicothérapeute.
pouvez vous présenter. D'accord, merci.
Bah oui,
This is a very important question as well. All the questions are important, but what you're saying about music, I think it's very true that music addresses parts of our existential lives that go directly very deep. And also, one of the problems with a lot of spiritual care research is that it's very rational, it's very verbal, it is very much done in the ways that people are able to communicate about what they feel. But most of our life, is subconscious. And most of the processes we go through are subconscious. So I think music therapy is a very important support in this field, not only for people who are suffering from dementia or people who are very fragile and do not have the energy to think or speak anymore, but for all patients. I would say it's a very important way of and if you ask me personally, I've been thinking, if I would be a palliative patient, would I need a spiritual caregiver? Well, maybe I've had too much reflection about spiritual care in my life. So I think I would rather listen to the music of Bach, which brings me more consolation without any words.
Merci. Alors, nous allons peut-être encore prendre 2 ou 3 questions. Nous arrivons au terme de...
Bonjour, je suis bénévole d'accompagnement.
Où êtes-vous?
Et ici. Je suis bénévole d'accompagnement et dans votre exposé, vous avez parlé des soignants par rapport aux besoins spirituels, pas du tout des bénévoles d'accompagnement, ce dont je suis très surpris, car c'est une grande partie de notre rôle, celui d'écoute et d'écoute de tout ce que le malade peut avoir envie de dire. Et là-dedans, il y a bien entendu beaucoup de spirituels. Et nous sommes formés particulièrement pour ça, pour l'écoute et pour savoir réagir par rapport à ces besoins spirituels. Donc, est-ce que ça veut dire que dans votre pays, il n'y a pas cette organisation? En France, nous sommes organisés pour des associations de bénévoles d'accompagnement qui sont formés plus particulièrement à écouter les malades.
Merci.
Oui, vous avez raison. I've talked about energy. You're right. I think the voluntary workers are very important in this area. And also in my country, there is a lot of work done in order to find out what can be the role of the voluntary workers in this area, and how can we find not only the right selection and formation of these people, but also to see how they can cooperate with the professional people. And this is still an area in development, I think. We need each other as European countries to exchange our experiences and to find ways to do this. Because you have seen in the big questionnaire that we did worldwide that it is not only the professional who is the preferred spiritual caregiver. Sometimes it is the voluntary worker or even a family member. It can be many people.
Merci. Encore 2 questions, monsieur?
Oui, bonjour, merci beaucoup pour votre présentation.
Je suis médecin en unité de soins palliatifs. Est-ce que vous présupposez qu'il y a une interaction avec votre patient et donc une élaboration de la pensée pour pouvoir permettre des liens spirituels? Et dans ce cas-là, comment faites-vous pour accompagner vos patients qui commencent à présenter ou qui présentent des troubles cognitifs, des troubles mnésiques avec une interaction beaucoup moins importante et qui pour autant continuent à interagir avec leur environnement, mais pour lesquels il n'y a pas de communication cohérente à proprement parler?
So let me first see if I understand your question right. How do I deal with patients who do not have coherent speech or a coherent way of expressing themselves? Yeah? Yeah.
Voilà, est-ce qu'il y a encore des liens spirituels chez quelqu'un qui ne peut plus élaborer une pensée cohérente?
Yeah. Well, I think maybe there this three-level idea of attention, accompaniment and crisis may be helpful. First, you have to see whether this patient, which is incoherent, has a kind of medical condition like a delirium or something, or another way of that they should be given some medications for the incoherence. But once you've solved that, I think you start at the lowest level of attentiveness and being there. So sometimes the human connection, that people are not left alone and that they feel that someone with inner space is next to them, is the most important. I have a wonderful example of a bénévolant in the Netherlands who told me about patients that were very restless, and he was waking at night with these dying patients, and they were restless. And he said, sometimes it's hard because I cannot do anything. I can just be there. And I asked him, so what do you do? What is your way of dealing with this? And then he said, well, what I'm trying to do is being connected with myself, keeping my inner space, and be sure that this kind of inner rest, this inner peace, is there and remains there. And then he says, I feel that this affects the patient. So there is a kind of bodily or subconscious communication between my peace and the patient's peace. And this is not something very special, because when I told it in the Netherlands at a conference, there was a nurse who came up to me and says, this is exactly what happens with my dog. When I'm nervous, my dog senses that I'm nervous, and it becomes nervous again. And when I become more in peace, then my dog is also more in peace. So there is an interaction. And this is something we can use because we are all of the same species. And this is maybe the most important and basic way of communicating.
Merci. Une dernière question avant la pause.
Clémence Joly, médecin en soins palliatifs. Je vous remercie beaucoup pour votre intervention, votre communication, et également pour la dernière réponse que vous venez d'apporter. Et justement, je voudrais le mettre en parallèle avec le fait que notre société, et donc la médecine, est de plus en plus technique, et nous, les soignants, on est aussi pris dedans. Il y a de plus en plus de difficultés à avoir une vie intérieure. C'est ce que disait déjà un écrivain français, Bernanos, il y a 100 ans. On est avec les écrans, les sollicitations, etc. Et donc, comment faire, et comment vous, en tant que professeur, vous pensez qu'on peut essayer de maintenir ce cap et de développer cette sensibilité à la spiritualité et à la vie intérieure qu'on doit avoir nous-mêmes en tant que soignants dans des environnements qui de plus en plus vont dans le sens inverse, y compris pour les soignants.
So how do we develop this inner life, this inner space in this society which is so technical and so... yeah, I think, well, the problem with this dimension is that every single person has his own process of development. So you have to start with education at universities, and then you have to prolong it during in the équipes where people work. So you have to be very clear that there is time to reflect on what has happened. There is time to evaluate what has happened when a patient has died. That there is an atmosphere of where it is normal to talk about these things. And there are some small tricks for this. For instance, in one of the hospices I work with, they have this idea of what they call cleaning your feet spiritually. I don't know if it's good English, I probably not. But they say, the nurses say, before I enter a room, I take some seconds and I realize that I'm entering someone's life and also someone who lives in a different time zone, so to speak. I come from this hectic time and I enter a room in which people have a completely different sense of what is important at that moment. And this short moment resets my inner space and helps me to enter the room and to listen carefully. And these are very small but very effective tricks that can help to develop a culture of attentiveness.
Merci. Merci beaucoup, Carlo. Je pense qu'on peut vous applaudir très fort.
Merci.
Merci.